200 million people is 1/3 of Latin America's population and about the same percentage of Latin America's economic activity. So it is truly the giant in the region. So developments in Brazil have enormous importance for the perception and the performance of the region as a whole. It is also, I think, very important to remember, as was said in the introduction, that Brazil may be one of the countries in the world which made greatest social progress during the decade of 2002 or 2003 until 2013. The social progress was remarkable, and it changed the face of social structure in Brazil. In fact, social structure in Brazil changed much more than economic structure. Just to have a few numbers that I think are important, Brazil middle class rose and surged from about 20% of the total population to about 42% of the total population. That's a major change. And in the early 2000s, about more than 40% of Brazilians were in poverty. And as of today, less than 20% of Brazilians are in poverty. So this is a major shift in social structure, a major progress. And I'm sure that that those changes create a very different context for politics and for the discussion of policy making and for the types of priorities that society has to deal with. And so the Brazil of today that's dealing with the problems that I will mention shortly is not by any means the Brazil of 20 years ago, even of 15 years ago. It's a very different country. It is one of the most prominent emerging market economies. It is one of the most important members of the BRICS, and it has been part of this substantial surge of economic activity outside of the traditional centers of economic activity, which were in the US and Europe. So we're talking about a very significant country and economy in the world and rising. However, this Brazil that rose and changed so much is now also one of the economies in the world that faces the most complicated macroeconomic problems. So it has, after the sort of golden decade it experiences now, finds itself in a very troubled situation, facing very little room to maneuver. And the policy makers encounter dilemmas that are not easy to deal with, particularly given that the expectations of the population are so high, and there's some adjustment pain that has to be borne by the population. And in no country, adjustment of macroeconomic accounts is easy, and it's even more complicated when the social demands are put a big premium on trying to make sure that the adjustment is done in a fair and equitable way. So let's talk a little bit about the troubles that Brazil finds itself. One way I would like to define the troubles that Brazil finds itself is that the macroeconomic situation, again, and unfortunately, has become a binding constraint to growth. This is a major contrast. If you look at a country like Peru or like Chile, you know, there are macroeconomic issues that people talk about. There are challenges in macroeconomic policy, but the growth agenda is not constrained by the macro. The macro may need some fixing, but growth can happen at the current macro conditions. In Brazil, unfortunately, the macroeconomic conditions have again become a constraint to growth. And that doesn't mean that actions cannot be taken, that they can be quite healthy and good. For instance, in the microeconomic agenda, things like education and improvements in infrastructure and improvements in logistics, all of those things can be helpful, but they are unlikely to deliver growth unless some of these big macro issues get solved. And that's what I mean when I say that the macro is a constraint on growth. So understanding the nature of the macro constraints, I think, is essential to discover the path through which an economy with a great prospects that Brazil has inherently because of its size, because of its human capital, because of its natural resource base, because of its geographic position, etc. The prospects are immense, but they unfortunately at the current juncture are constrained by important and complicated macroeconomic issues. So let me tell you a little bit a picture of the conundrum in the macro. First, you have a phenomenon that is never good to have, which is stagflation. In Brazil, the economy is contracting. It is shrinking at the rate of about 3.5% per year. Some observers think that it may be hitting bottom, and maybe the next year will be the beginning of a recovery, that the slowdown is slowing down in some sense. But there's no question that Brazil has been undergoing in the past 2 years or so the deepest recession for many years. And unfortunately, this recession has been accompanied by inflationary pressures, which is not what normally we are expected to see. When an economy is soft and it is exhibiting high unemployment and slow economic activity or contracting economic activity, normally the inflationary pressures are very low or non-existent. But in Brazil, partly because of the depreciation of the currency, the inflation pressures have been there. So that creates this syndrome of economic contraction with inflation pressures. And that is a major constraint on the ability of monetary policy to be more stimulative. Central bank in Brazil, like in many other Latin American countries, would love to be able to lower the interest rate to help the recovery of economic activity. Unfortunately, the interest rate that the central bank sets in Brazil has to be kept at a high level for fear that the expectations on inflation may get unhinged. So that's the first part of the phenomenon. The second part of the phenomenon is a very large fiscal disequilibrium. Brazil had impressed the world during the 2000s by establishing a fiscal policy that generated what we economists call primary fiscal surplus. So from the beginning of the 2000s until 2013, the fiscal accounts in Brazil generated a primary surplus of about 2 to 2.5% of GDP. Very considerably important source of fiscal strength, to the point that most economists have thought that Brazil had overcome, in a very significant way, through better fiscal institutions, the problems they used to have in the past. Unfortunately, since 2013, the fiscal accounts have entered into a disequilibrium position, and the primary surplus now has become a primary deficit. It went from a primary surplus of about 2 to 2.5% to a deficit of 2 to 2.5%. So it's an important switch in fiscal strength and position. And at the same time, because of the problem I mentioned before that forces the central bank to keep the interest rate high, at the same time, the interest bill of the government has gone up tremendously. So about the interest payments in the budget of Brazil are about the equivalent of about 8% of GDP. That's very large. So when you add the interest payments that Brazil has to make, plus the fact that it has a primary fiscal deficit, what we get is that Brazil has an overall fiscal deficit of about 10% of GDP, which is a very large amount. And it presents a major challenge to politicians on how you're going to promote the position in ways that can be socially digestible. And so this is a major conundrum, and for me, the path towards growth in Brazil will need some sort of a credible restoration of viable and more robust fiscal position. And that goes through, as in every country, through a significant political discussion. The second, and this is the last problem I want to mention, the second but very important macro problem that Brazil has is that it is not clear, to me at least, that dealing with a fiscal process and the fiscal disequilibrium will by itself help Brazil bring interest rates down. The problem of a high real interest rate in Brazil has got a history, and it's one of the great mysteries in economics in Latin America. Why is Brazil, a country with so many strengths, having to have such a high interest rate? This is a complicated subject. It has haunted economists for many, many years. I have written about it. It still is a bit of a mystery. But what you have in Brazil is that a very high interest rate. The short-term interest rate now in Brazil is around 14.5%, which is very high compared to, say, international interest rates. But at the same time, what you see is that the financial contracts that are organized in Brazilian markets around this interest rate are all very short-term. They have collapsed in very short-term positions, and so this combination of a very high interest rate and short-term contracts create a very bad equilibrium that creates a not very friendly environment for the expansion of the economy, for long-term credit, and for a more healthy role of the financial system. And so the historical roots of why Brazil has such a short-term, a tendency to make financial contracts so short-term, which is unusually, where Brazil is an outlier, combined with a high interest rate, create another macroeconomic policy conundrum. And it's difficult to see, for instance, how Brazil will be able to finance infrastructure investment and all of that long-term development needs when it has to live with an interest rate that's so high and a tendency of the financial system to be collapsed and concentrated in such short-term instruments. Brazil is dominated by the short-term in ways no other countries are. Most financial contracts in Brazil are repriced every night in light of the Selic. So that's a kind of a difficult and bad equilibrium to have. So for me, dealing with these two big macroeconomic problems, the fiscal disequilibrium, which is not easy to deal with, and on the other hand, this combination of a very high interest rate and very short-term financial contracts are for me, are the two nodes that constrain growth from the macroeconomic perspective, and they need to be at the forefront of the policy agenda if Brazil will find again a path to growth and to continue with the social progress it made in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. De La Torre, for that wonderful overview of some of the macro challenges that are facing Brazil. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Klaben now, who's going to give us a little bit of a different perspective, and he's going to talk about how Brazil has prioritized climate change initiatives and sustainable development policies as an engine to promote growth. Dr. Klaben, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Augusto, I think that I'm not an economist, so mainly I'm not a macroeconomist. I subscribe whatever you said. I think your analysis technically and professionally very profound, and I'm ready to follow you, and I'm sure that most of my friends who work on that field, they would agree with your point. But let me say that my own presentation, according to what I received as instructions on my previous emails, are more connected with first two parts. The first part being what is the success of the Olympics and what might be the relation that everybody have in mind of the success of the Olympics with the future of Brazil, which it does have an implication. So we recover the optimism, we recover the idea that this country have some ways that are not very orthodox, but in the end gives what we call a jeitinho, a way out. So let me begin telling you a little bit about Rio. I know quite well Rio because I was mayor of Rio, which I didn't like at all, because I was frustrated with the lack of possibility of doing what was my dream, which was reestablishing some of the glory of Rio as a capital, which it really happened now with the Olympics. So this week is definitely a turning point, not only to Rio, but in Brazil as a whole. First, because we really have a very successful event, this Olympics. The second one is that today begins the final stage of the Dilma impeachment and beginning of a 2.5 years of interim government staged by Michel Temer, with the promise of economic improvement and a higher participation of the private sector, which is already not only a promise, but we are beginning to see the results. Well, the important background history of the city of Rio, moving First, because it was moving, when they moved the capital to the 60s, in the 60s, I believe that was one of the main factors that contributed to the 64 military takeover, due to a strange destruction of the previous political balance, in a way, which was quite stable. Well, Rio then became a state by itself, a city-state called State of Guanabara, that was quite, let us say, inherited some of the qualities of the capital and have their own destiny inside their own hands. Then finally got the merger with the state of Rio, with the consequence of economic and political decadence, which it stayed until practically until the Olympics. And you know that Rio is one municipality and the state of Rio is completely destructive and destroyed in terms of its own economy. Well, the important points to be considered is that the economic consequences of the Olympics to the city of Rio were immense. Estimated amount of additional consumption coming from tourism, it was something like $2 billion. And that most probably will leverage, and that in 2 weeks' time. And that more probably will leverage to something like $4 billion in medium-term income to the city, which is something that we really needed. Overall, the effects of the Olympics were 98% positive according to the media and the social networks. So this is the climate that we have right now in Rio. Aside from the expectation of this happening in Brasilia, which means the end of the process of impeachment and finally promise of a new Brazil. Well, according to the Goldman Sachs appraisal of the investment related to the Olympics, they are divided in 3 main segments. First, something like 8 billion reais in operational and cost financed by the private sector. So you see, at least half of the cost of the Olympics were financed by private sector, which is something very, very interesting. Then we have 7 billion in sport infrastructure and other projects that would not exist in Rio, wouldn't have been given the Olympics, out of which 60% were invested again by the private sector. The other 25 billion in projects have been invested, and they are the legacy that we got, by federal, state, and municipal governments in infrastructure and other programs of public policies. And those projects are mainly an important legacy of modernizing the whole system of urban mobility. And Rio really became a very nice and viable city to live in. Among these important investments, add the retrofit of downtown area, as said above, great advances in urban mobility in general. The most important effect of the Olympics is that the city recovered the pride, as I said before, that had been lost when the capital was moved to Brasilia. Whether this is going to remain or not is to be seen. I would suggest, if I would have somebody to suggest that approach, that London Economic Institutional Framework could be the model for the future of Rio as a bridge between international financial system on one hand and tourist and cultural services on the other. Rio economy is still highly dependent on 3 factors. Royalties coming from oil gas, which, as you know, the drop of the price of oil provided one of the basic leverage for the crisis. Tourism and cultural services. Well, now let's see what Brazil is to be seen today in aftermath of probably what's happening in this weekend, which is the withdrawal and definitive takeover of the new government of Mr. Michel Temer, and what is to be expected. Well, the historic background of Brazil, 64 to 88, we had a military dictatorship. Let's not forget that resuming in a fully democratic system, that we resumed the fully democratic system in 1988, and it has become matured and became a well-organized democracy up to our days as a consequence of the end of Lula-Dilma era. The rule of law, obedience to constitutional rules, and end of a populist government with its national and international consequence is being implemented. The economic agenda of the new government looks positive. Brazil is recovering, and I can resume it as follows. Consumer and producers' confidence today, the indexes are higher than a year ago. Economic projections say that recession will end in August 16, but only in 2017 we will see a 12-month period growth. I hope that you agree with that. Actually, exchange rates are favorable to export prospects. Long-term interest rates are falling. Brazilian government and companies are facing lower risk premium for fundraising in international markets from 500 points to 300 points. Industrial sector is growing for the last 5 months, and stocks are finally adjusting to lower demand. GDP projections are 1.5 in 2017 and 3% or better in 2018. The new government was able to approve in Congress a law that flexibilized 30% of its budgetary expense for social security, education, and health experts. Augusto, those data I got this morning from a former colleague of you, Mr. He is the head of the bank institution, Murilo Portugal. I'm sorry. It was I think you agree that those data coming from him is something that you should discuss with him, not with me. Well, the great challenges ahead, and we agree with that. The industrial sector still has a significant idle capacity. Fiscal adjustment not yet approved, but it is in advanced stage in negotiations with the Congress. For the last 2 years, Dilma has increased public debt in 15 points, from 54% of GDP to 69%, which is very high for developing countries. Government is running on a negative primary superavit of less 2.5% of GDP. Specialists say it should be plus 2.5% in order to balance public debt trajectory. Propositions over the table. Let's see if you agree with that. Limit government expenses to previous year value plus inflation rate in real-term growth. Expected to be approved by Congress this year. Social Security reform. Social Security cost represents 40% of the total government annual expenses. Approval is extremely challenging, but is gradually being absorbed by the Brazilian society, and the negotiations with the Congress began already. And finally, we need a much better government efficiency. It goes without saying that was really something that was inherited by this government, and it has to be fixed. Well, government is struggling to reduce the number of ministers. No significant reduction of our operational cost was implemented, although there is a debate over an increase in taxation for the next future, or the new future. Well, let's move a little bit from Brazil to a world scenario. Brazil's geopolitical position. All democracies in general are in a critical changing mood. I think we agree with that, and that's one of the reasons that Bretton Woods Committee have their hands full. We live under the domain of the GDP on one hand, and on the other hand, we live under the sensation of insecurity, terrorism, and questioning the quality of life, which is one of the most important challenges in the democratic world. Violence comes from intolerance and lack of equal opportunities. Governments have to be evaluated by the quality of the services provided to the population, and not only by the lip service democracy is providing. Of course, this is my own personal view, and I'm ready to add or subtract to it what I can hear from someone better qualified than me, which means perhaps you and other members of the committee that are hearing me. In the end, we are waiting for the arrival of Godot. Godot, it seems that is no longer at the United Nations, the IMF, and all the structures that were so enormously successfully implemented after 48 and the Bretton Woods. I believe that those institutions are already calling for reforms to supply the continuation of the fantastic results that social democracy has provided to the world between 48 and today, at a rate that was never attended in the past. Of course, we need global rules to attend programs such as climate change, human rights, and terrorism. But one way or the other, we have to understand that every country has a different path to arrive at the same goal, and as a consequence, it needs the adaptation of some remedies. This is even more true to Brazil, due to its continental size and regional differences within our own border. Brazil stands a very good chance to overcome its recent past disarrays. The new government has established some of the possible priorities to correct the economic situation. On the other hand, the private sector in general is having a very rapid recovery, and we believe that next year we will have again a positive GDP growth. The great destination of Brazil as an important economy in the world, I believe, is its immense possibility to be a dominant factor in producing high-yield agriculture. Brazil is already the largest producer of grains and food in general, something around this year 220 million tons this year alone. According to our best projections, and we work on that because of our climate and because of our environmental institution, we arrived at a projection that in 2050, Brazil will be producing 650 million tons of food commodities, which means the total food security that the world needs. So I think that between a critical macroeconomics and the good ambience that the new government and the Olympics brought to Brazil, we might have a chance of correcting in a faster period, in a faster term than it is expected. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Klavan, for your really insightful comments, especially on the impact that the Olympics have had on Rio and on Brazil. I'm very interested in your perspective. I want to pick up on a couple of themes here. So I think I'd like to ask Dr. De La Torre, first of all, if he would want to respond to some of your statistics regarding GDP and some of the more positive indicators of growth that several economists are reporting for the years ahead for Brazil. I guess, has Brazil hit rock bottom, and is there nowhere to go but up from here, is one question. And then secondly, for Dr. De La Torre, I'd like to get your perspective on the impacts of the Olympics, kind of at the macro level, if there really is any impact at all. Dr. Klavan talked a bit about the cultural impact and the impact on the the sort of momentum and the attitude of the population. But there's been, well-documented research that has said historically that Olympics have really brought no financial benefit to cities and countries that have hosted them. And of course, we know some of the enormous budget numbers that Rio and Brazil had to spend on this Olympics. So just want to hear your thoughts on that as well. If at the macro level you do see any type of impact from hosting these games.
Sure. Both are a little important and not easy questions to answer. I agree with Israel that the most respected economies in Brazil and observers from Brazil from outside all seem to have a consensus that this may be the last year of the recession and that the economy would start growing again next year. The optimism varies, but there is general a tone of optimism that growth next year will at least be close to 1%, and some people are hoping it will be closer to 2%, maybe 1.6% seems to be the consensus. So there are indications that those are projections that are grounded on some evidence that is observable. For example, the index of industrial production is in the positive range now. There are significant improvements in consumer confidence and confidence variables. And there seems to be a movement of private investment going on, some of it perhaps linked to the Olympics. And so the only, I think, nagging variable in this scenario that overall looks with optimism towards next year is the fact that the unemployment rate is high, and most economists think that the unemployment rate will not come down too soon. So we may have several months of what economists call jobless growth, where the economic activity is expanding, but unemployment may not be declining. And that's not a small matter, no, because more than growth, I think employment matters more for the people. And people react to that. So, but overall, I think Israel is absolutely right that there is a strong consensus among all the observers that are respected and that look at Brazil that this may be the last year of the recession, and we will see again an economy that is recovering and beginning to grow towards the end of this year and the beginning of next year. So that's right. I do want to mention that for that to have a virtuous circle and to be self-propelling and to create a positive dynamics, one would also hope that that's accompanied by a decline in the interest rate, because that should help stimulate investment and open spaces for activity. And that's an important question mark. How fast will inflation come down without, how fast will inflation come down and therefore will make room for the interest rate to come down. But I think that's the convergence that we all would like to see and hope to see, and indications are that we may begin to see that process next year. A lot of it will depend on how credible all of these announcements about the fiscal corrections are. These things that Israel was mentioning, things that are before Congress to consider, such as, for instance, the limit on spending growth and things like that. To the extent that they coalesce and there's political support for that, and people think that the fiscal path is on a credible trajectory, the recovery of the economy should be on firmer grounds. So I think we're all hoping that this will happen. Every Latin American that I know of, including myself, would love to see a Brazil that is back to growth. Your question on the macro impact of the Olympics, that is trickier. What I would like to rescue is something that Israel said, which I think is striking, which is most of the investments that were done for the Brazil Olympics seem to have come from the private sector, unlike other countries where the Olympics are largely financed out of the budget. So that's an important factor, because it probably suggests, and I am not familiar with all of the details, It probably suggests that the spending that made the Olympics possible are not a burden on the budget, will not be a future burden on the budget, and that takes away one important macroeconomic source of concern about macroeconomic impacts of Olympics, because if the governments are saddled with debts and liabilities and spending that as a result of the Olympics, then maybe that will hinder macroeconomic in the future. So the fact that it was private, largely private, is, I think, excellent news. The only thing is that the Olympics do showcase a country, and many people are able to visit the country, see the beauty of Brazil, and they are delighted with its people, with its culture, its food, with its geography, and with its potential, and that may stimulate private investment. So to the extent that the Olympics lead to more positive investment optimism, it could have a positive effect on the macro and therefore on growth. So perhaps Brazil will be one example where the Olympics on net helped this process of economic recovery and expansion.
Should I comment?
Yeah, sure. Dr. Klavan, would you like to follow up on that?
Yes, definitely. I think that what Augusto said is fully, absolutely right. We will have for many years a problem for underemployment. That's the worst inheritance we got from the Dilma government and the macroeconomic structure that we inherited. But on the other hand, we think that other frontiers of development are being developed. For instance, we have right now on our hands here at the Foundation a gigantic project of regional development in the northeastern part of the country, which is really underdeveloped part of the country. And this region is already, let's say, half of the size of Europe. We are being financed by the GEF, by the Global Environment Facility, on developing what they call the Matopiba, which means Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and the north of Bahia. If this is going to happen, we might have a drive on internal immigration and hopefully outside immigration. Against the very principle that you look at it coming from all sides of Europe, we are very much for immigration. I think that we need selected immigration or unselected immigration, but fertile immigration, what we can call. Considering mainly that they are not coming to large cities. They will have to go to the hinterland for developing this agricultural frontier that definitively is tempting everyone to address. Well, my previous profession, before I'm 30 years in an environment, was planting trees. So I had a background that was already environmental. And one of the projects that we have implies on planting 12 million hectares of native forests. And that in between that is a legal procedure that had been approved by the Congress and is constrained of everyone that have a piece of land in Brazil. It's the forest law. So that in itself will demand a tremendous frontier of investment that will probably oblige Brazilians to behave in an absolutely homogeneous environmental destination of the country. Next Monday, as soon as the president will be confirmed, which it will happen in this weekend, he's calling for a meeting in Brasilia to everybody to see him signing the Paris Treaty. So the implementation of the Paris Treaty in legal terms in Brazil means a lot. One of the main countries that have in terms of biodiversity, the most important destination on carbon sink. That's important, not only as an example, but also as a basic principle that will have to be absorbed everywhere. Of course, in energy, we are quite clean in Brazil, which again is quite an advantage over many of the countries that are have still a high level of emissions. So if we concentrate in my areas of environment, I think Brazil is behaving quite well and will have a pretty good success. And I think that this is one of the most important. In the end, it will become an economic problem. Perhaps it will fall on your hands, Antonio or Augusto, to see how we can implement some of the pricing of environmental services. That is quite a challenge for you macroeconomists to see what's going to be the success and the transference of responsibility of the actual currencies into something that is more touchable and more let us say, important to the end, to the destiny of humanity. Well, this is some of the comments that I have for what you said, and let us hope that we can walk hand on hand in the future in the search of new ways. I believe really that the economy is a discipline, is a science too. But to implement the discipline, you have to have discipline. And this is what we are searching for, to have the discipline to be able to comply with what you expect in terms of macroeconomics.
Thanks, okay. Dr. Clay. I just want to remind our audience that if you have questions, so please type them into the questions pane. We'll get to questions in just a moment. But I want to pick up on commodity prices a little bit. Dr. Klavan has brought them up. He's mentioned the agricultural sector. He's mentioned the energy sector. And of course, volatile commodity prices and the decline in commodity prices have really impacted Brazil in the past year. So I guess, Dr. De La Torre, I guess I would ask you, how can Brazil diversify its economy to become less dependent on commodities? And then perhaps Dr. Klavan could follow that up with in a sustainable manner.
Are you asking Augusto or me?
I'm going to ask Dr. De La Torre first, and then we'll follow up with you.
Okay.
Okay, so your question on commodity price, I think, is crucial to Brazil as it is to practically every country in South America, because South America is a unique region in the planet. It is an incredibly rich in natural resources region. Some countries of the region, including Brazil, have rich mineral resources. Some countries in the region, including Brazil, have enormous agricultural resources. Brazil, in fact, is now the greatest world exporter of poultry and other types of meats, I believe. And in agriculture, Brazil is a powerhouse. And it has so much agricultural frontier to develop that if it does it in a sustainable manner, Brazil will be one of the countries that will actually feed the world in the future. So, of course, these developments cannot hinge only on the price. Doing this well is not just a matter of price; it's a matter of good production practices, whether you are in minerals, whether you are in agriculture, and that are sustainable and that meet with expectations. But this is our strength in South America. So when you say how can we diversify, we have to realize that we begin by a structure of wealth that nature has given us, which is tilted in favor of natural resources. So as we try to diversify, and Brazil is one of the most diversified economies in Latin America, as we try to diversify, we have to play to our strengths. We cannot diversify ignoring our comparative advantages in agriculture and in mining. We have to kind of put our feet on that basis and find what else we can do to move the way in which we produce things, the way in which we conduct economic activities, in a way that require more human capital, more educated human capital, better skills, more knowledge, in a way that allows us to integrate into the world in ways that are productive for our own populations. And that creates an important role for the way in which we trade, the way in which we do foreign investment. So my sense is that commodities, including mineral and agriculture, will be with us for many years to come. They are potentially a source of strength. We have to treat them carefully because commodities can be a curse. If we don't manage them appropriately, they can be a curse. And they are a curse in some countries in Latin America. Just look at Venezuela. But if you use them well, then you can have a trajectory in economic development similar to that of Australia or New Zealand or the United States or Canada, which were countries that in their initial stages and middle stages of development relied on their natural resources to develop broader and more diverse economies, but always on the basis of something that nature has given you and you have to treat with care.
You bring up some really interesting points regarding the comparative advantage there and how other countries have developed from a commodity-based and agriculture-based society, and I think we tend to forget that sometimes. So I think I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Klaban to respond to that, and perhaps, Dr. Klaban, you can address, how can Brazil use its comparative advantage with its natural resources and the energy and the mineral and the agricultural sector to leverage those in a sustainable way?
Well, Augusto, you know that international trade is a key for success in a country so diversified as Brazil is. We have been prisoners of this famous Mercosur, and now it seems that we are going out of it. The government agrees, and the conversation began already for us to try to make an agreement where Mercosur without Venezuela, which is a lost case, as you know, together with the Pacific Conference. If we can manage to get more diverse approach on our international trade, that would be the first step. So if there is a market, there will be natural resources capacity of being elevated to a tradable asset. And but I think on the other hand, that tradable success means modernity, and modernity means innovation. And to get innovation, we need either to import innovation or to create innovation. Both areas have to be tackled by the new government, and we are working on that already. Innovation, and that's my own personal view. I think innovation goes together with immigration. I like the issue of immigration because it's a catalytic element for growth, whether we like it or not. It's not a substitutional immigration as it was in Europe as a whole. It has to be a creative immigration. People that goes to the field and work by themselves are not substituting national capacity of production. And that is what we are trying to find, not only the sources and the way. As you know, for instance, I was in Brussels on discussing the Sustainable Development Goals together with the European community, and I had a meeting with a lady that represents the small agricultural syndicate all around Europe. And I discussed this matter with her, and she was very, very excited with the idea of making some kind of agreement with Brazil where some type of agricultural groups would like to try their hand producing the same thing that are producing in Europe, in Brazil, in much better economic terms, and keeping the European market. So, I mean, tricks like that are really some of the possibilities that Brazil have, mainly considering, for instance, what we are going to have in terms of regional development in the northeastern part. So, you have to use your imagination in this world that have some kind of stagnation in the model of growth and some time of eruption in the social environmental context. I think to get out of it, we need to use our imagination, and mainly you guys in Washington have a great responsibility of not sitting on the past, but creating the future.
Well, we're running out of time, but I do want to get to one quick question from the audience. And we have a question from Melissa Smith, who asks, how can countries bidding to host future Olympics more successfully and sustainably integrate infrastructure developments that need to be undertaken for the Olympics with the needs of the population? How can they do this while remaining fiscally responsible and without becoming another failed Olympic city story?
You're asking me?
Either one of you.
Augusto. Well, I don't know whether I understand well your question. I think that you think that the same mobilization that we had to the Olympics can be reproduced somewhere in the country, right?
I think the question is, how do you use the investments in infrastructure such as the stadiums more successfully and sustainably? Oh,
you're talking about Rio itself.
Yes.
Well, Rio itself is a case study. The environment and the psychological reaction of Rio have been wonderful. There's no doubt that the reception, national and international reception of what happened in Rio is a byproduct of the Olympics, and it's there to stay. Whether we'll be able to collect it or not depends very much on what's going to happen in the near future, which means a new election, a new mayor, a new national government that will be supportive of producing out of Rio something like what I said in my presentation, that we need a destiny of Rio investment in the Olympics. And for that, we need to internationalize Rio. Rio have to become a link, a bridge between Brazil and the rest of the world. This is what I think that we should work on in the next year or so. I believe that we have possibilities. Of course, there is always some challenge of other parts of the country that would like to do the same. But the real conditions are in Rio, for sure, in Brazil, to be that bridge that we need so strongly, which means open to the rest of the planet. The possibilities have to come through Rio, and we need a financial international structure to be mounted here, to be erected here, which I believe it's possible with the help of perhaps the World Bank. What do you think, Augusto?
I think we'll let Dr. De La Torre have the final word on infrastructure and development from the Olympics.
Yeah, no, I think that Israel is absolutely right that in the case of Rio, the potential for positive spillover effects of the Olympics is probably higher than in other places. Now, there's always always going to be a political discussion as to whether a government should invest in improving the stadium versus improving schools, and that you cannot avoid that discussion. But I think in the end, what matters is what happens over time, and whether the Olympics have put Rio into a new sphere of prestige, of recognition, of presence in the global arena, whether Rio has become more of a pole of attraction. And possible, just think, for instance, of Barcelona. I think that Olympics in Barcelona changed the face of Barcelona internationally, and it made it much more of a cosmopolitan place, and they were the beginning of a virtuous circle that I think created great urban improvement. And this is not trivial because so much of the population live in cities. Urban issues, urban infrastructure, urban amenities, urban security, urban transportation, all of these things are so important, and I don't see why one can take advantage of something like the Olympics in order to modernize those infrastructures that are so important for human lives, as most of us humans now live in cities. And I think very few people will doubt that Greece is among the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful cities in the planet. So if the Olympics probably made that case even stronger.
Yeah. Well, Augusto, if I may, not interrupting you, I think you are absolutely right about the comparison between Barcelona and Rio. Barcelona did not resolve the structural economic problems of Spain, but really resolved its destiny as a city that was successful in one of their undertakings. So perhaps this is a good comparison. Rio might be able to produce its own destiny, and in the meantime, we are going to see what's going to happen in the rest of the country. The promises are big, and the guidelines that are being promoted by the new government, I don't know what you say, because you know more than I do. If the remedies that are being proposed are correct, I believe that it will take 2 or 3 years to correct the national situation, if the international situation also is resolved, because we really have something, roadblocks ahead of us, not coming from Brazil, but coming from the rest of the world, which includes Latin America. You know, a very difficult situation that comes even from Argentina, even from Chile. Peru perhaps is one of the good approaches, but that's not so influential in terms of the continent as a whole. On the other hand, we have Venezuela, which is a problem by itself. So there's not a lack of problems, and perhaps there is a lack of opportunities, but let's hope that it can overcome.
Yeah, there's certainly challenges ahead, but I think you both have outlined that there's a lot of reason for optimism for Brazil in the coming years as well. So unfortunately, we've run out of time today. I want to thank you both very much for joining us and for your wonderful and rich dialogue. It was very interesting and insightful, in my opinion. So thank you very much. I want to thank all of our audience in attendance as well. We will be posting a recording of the virtual conference on our website, and you will also receive it via email in the next couple of days. So once again, on behalf of the Bretton Woods Committee, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Israel.
Bye-bye, August. Hope to see you next meeting of the Bretton Woods. Huh?
Yes.